What is prototypal inheritance? Prototypal inheritance is an alternative, object-oriented solution. Some argue a more natural OO solution for JavaScript, but at the very least, it's a lot easier to understand. And this question is a lot easier to answer. The big thing to understand about prototypal inheritance is that we have already answered it. It's just the prototype chain. Nothing more, nothing less. We don't create a class or a pseudo class in the same sense that we do for classical inheritance. There are no function constructors, and we don't use the new keyword. We basically say, hey, create an object whose prototype is this other object. Oh, and also bootstrap this new object with some properties. One of the benefits of using the prototype pattern is that we're working with the tools JavaScript has to offer natively, rather than attempting to imitate features of other languages like our fake classes, like we tried to create with the function constructors and the new keyword. Let me show you with a few examples. I'm just going to create an object literal called person. And you might recognize this code. This is the same full name function that we had in the previous question. So I'm just going to copy and paste the same code in. Okay, so we've got person object with the full name function, and this will just print out the full name of the person. This is our base object, our base person object. We then create another object whose prototype points to this base person object. Now in JavaScript, how do we create an object and define what the prototype of that object should be? We do that by using the object.create function. And let me just run that snippet. So now I've created an object called asim whose prototype points to the person object by using the object.create function. And what I've basically created is this structure on the screen. We've got the asim object, and the prototype of the asim object points to the person object, and the prototype of the person object, well actually the prototype of the person object points to object, but I don't have a lot of space on the screen, so I'm just pretending it points to null. And that's what we've done. We've created a prototype chain. And the important thing to note is that on the person object, we have the full name function. So the full name function is on the person object, which is a prototype of the asim object. So that means if I wanted to call the full name function, I can just do asim.fullName, and it will print out the full name. Or will it? Actually, for us it won't, because we haven't actually defined what first name and last name is. So how do you do that with the prototype pattern? In the constructor pattern, we had a function constructor, and inside there we could bootstrap the values of these variables. But we don't seem to have that anymore in the prototype pattern. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to solve this problem. The first way I'm going to show you is just by having another function on the person object. I'm going to call it init. Actually, I'm going to copy and paste this code. There we go. Okay. So now I've created a function called init, which accepts first name, last name, bootstraps it to this. And at the end, I'm just returning this. You don't have to. It's just, I think it's a good thing to do. So now if I want to initialize, I will just do asim.init and then asim Hussein. And then when I call full name, the first name and last name will be set, and it will print out what we expect. And there we go. So now on line 14, it's printing out asim Hussein. The second way of initializing the asim object is via the second parameter to the object.create function. So if you remember, the second parameter is an object that describes the properties that we want on the asim object, the object that it is creating. So the syntax is slightly different to what you might be expecting. So I just pasted that in. So you can see, you might have expected the syntax to be something like first name, asim, last name, Hussein. That might have been what you expected the syntax to be, okay? But that's incorrect. That's not how this particular parameter works. This particular parameter just describes the types of properties that you want created and different parameters on those properties. Not only the value, but whether it's enumerable, read and writable, etc., etc. I covered in the previous lecture. If you want to find more details about this property, then just read up on the object.create function on the link I posted in the previous lectures. But let's go back to where we were before. So you can parse it, you can bootstrap it by adding in a property of first name, which is an object with a value of asim. And similarly for the last name, you want a value of Hussein. So we can bootstrap it this way as well. And so now, let me get rid of this code here and give myself some space. So you can all see it all on one screen. So the person object just has full name function. And when we create the asim object, we bootstrap the first name and the last name, and then we can print it out at the bottom. Let's get some more space again. Clear the console, run it. And there you go. Asim Hussein printed out again at the bottom. So that's another solution. Personally, I find this solution very verbose. There's a lot of characters you've got to type to get this working. So I prefer this third solution. So I'm going to just get back to where we were there. And I'm going to create another function called person factory. First name, last name. So a factory is a function that just returns an object. So what we can do is just move our object create function inside there. Let's just call it person. Then we can do what we want. I'm going to do person.firstName is equal to first name passed in. And I'm going to do the same with last name. I'm just going to say return person. Oh, return person. And now when I want to create my asim object, I just do var asim is equal to person factory asim Hussein. And then again, I can just console log asim.fullname. So clear the console again, hit run, and there we go, line 16, Asim Hussein gets printed out. Which solution should you use? Unfortunately, there isn't a right solution, at least not one accepted by everybody. So it's just personal preference really at this point. Personally, I prefer either the person factory approach, or I will create an init or a create function on the person object itself. Okay, so now we've covered how to create instances of objects which point to other objects via their prototype. So the next question is, how do we inherit? And the big realization I'd love for you to have right now is that with the prototype pattern, there isn't any specific inheritance methodology. We just keep on adding to the prototype chain. So again, let me just show you with some code. So in the previous example, I created a class called professional, which inherits from person. If I wanted to do the same thing here, I would just do var professional is equal to object.createPerson, and then var asim is equal to object.createProfessional. And just comment the rest of that out just so we can focus on these important lines of code here. So that's it really. I create the person object with an object literal. I then create a professional object which points to that person object via its prototype. I then create an asim object which points to the professional object via its prototype. Let me show you a slide. So what I'm describing is just what's on the screen right now. We have the asim object, which then points to the professional object via its prototype, and the professional object then points to the person object, and the person object points to, well, object really, and the object then points to null. That's all I'm doing. That's it. That's the prototype pattern, and that's how you do inheritance in the prototype pattern, just via the object.create function. Let me show you by debugging some code. So now we can bootstrap on our professional object a set of functions and a set of properties, just again by using the second parameter to the object.create function. So in fact, we can do something like this. So now this professional object is going to be bootstrapped with a function called professional name, and that will print out honorific, first name, and last name. Then at the bottom, if we wanted to, we could print out professional name there. But also we'll need to bootstrap the professional object, our asim object, with some initial values. Now we could do, again, a couple of different methods of solving this problem. One of them is just to add another function to be bootstrapped onto the professional object. So again here, I can add an init function, which then has honorific first name and last name and bootstraps it that way. And then to take advantage of that, I can just do asim.init Mr. Asim Hussein. So that's one way. Alternatively, I could create a professional factory with honorific, and then do something very similar to what I had before, which was something along this line. And then so again, this is another way of solving that problem. Or there's a third method of just adding these functions directly onto the professional object. So before creating an instance of asim, we could also do professional.init is equal to function, and then add our function to the professional object that way. So just the same as the person object, there are just three ways of adding functions. There actually might be a couple of other ways as well if you stretch your imagination. But I think these are the three of the most obvious and popular ways of adding functions. So one would be via the object.create function. The other one would be just directly by adding them as parameters, as properties to the object. And the third one is perhaps by using a factory function. For this example, I'm going to use the object.create method of bootstrapping some properties onto our professional object. And then let me just comment this stuff at the bottom out. And then let's clear the console. Let's debug this so you can see it. And actually, let me add asim to the watch. Expand this out. So you can see we've got the asim object. It has first name, honorific, and last name as we expect. Its prototype points to something which has an init function and a professional name function. So it's pointing to, its prototype points to the professional object itself. And the professional object points to something which has a full name to the professional object itself. If you remember, it points to, its prototype points to person. So that's it. That's the prototype pattern. There's nothing crazy about it. There's nothing complex about it. It's just the prototype chain. It's just connecting objects to objects via their prototypes. So you might be asked in the interview, when would you use the prototype pattern and when might you use the constructor pattern? You're going to find a whole segment of JavaScript developers which really support the prototype pattern. And you're going to find a whole segment of JavaScript developers which support the pseudo-classical or the constructor pattern. But really, you should have an idea of what some of the pros and cons are of each solution. So what are the pros for the constructor pattern? Well, the number one is by far it's the most common. It's used everywhere. So at the very least, you should know it because then you need to be able to recognize code that's written in it. If you are coming from other languages like Java and C++, the constructor pattern will feel more natural to you because it mimics the kind of object-oriented syntax which you would have in other languages. And another pro for the constructor pattern is that it allows constructs like private variables, private member variables. And if you can imagine from the prototype pattern, that doesn't support that feature at all. So what are some of the pros for the prototype pattern? Well, I think the number one pro is very easy to understand the prototype pattern. There's not many moving parts. It's quite simple. And once you get the prototype pattern, once you get just how simple it is, then it feels more natural to JavaScript. It feels a more natural way of doing object orientation in JavaScript. But really, I think it just depends at the end of the day. If you're working with a team and they really like the prototype pattern, use the prototype pattern. If you're working with a team and they like the constructor pattern, use the constructor pattern. But it's actually really important to know both the patterns, because you're going to see code written using both of them, and therefore you need to be able to recognize that code and what it's doing.